the subject does need to be started, does need to be brought up, and sometimes it's probably good to start to bring it up casually around the kitchen table. That it's not so much of a big formal conversation, but I think it can be as simple as starting that conversation and starting to say, well, have you an interest in the farm, or do you know I'm considering maybe giving you the farm, or there's options here for you on the farm. But it is starting to broach the subject, and maybe it's breaking down the subject into smaller parts. That it doesn't have to be this big monumental conversation that's that someone fears.
I'm joined this week by Dr. Tomás Russell, who is Assistant Professor in Agricultural Extension and Innovation at the School of Agricultural and Food Science, University College Dublin. Tomás joins us to discuss the considerations people should make when it comes to farm succession and inheritance. So thanks for joining us, Tomás.
No problem, James. Delighted to be on the dairy edge.
Maybe to start us off, Tomás, this is obviously a very sensitive topic, but also a very important one for generational renewal. Why do we find it so difficult to discuss, and is it unique to Ireland?
Yeah, it's a very good question. And I suppose to start, it's not really unique to Ireland, although it seems to be a bit more prominent in Ireland. Farmers just don't like having conversations around succession. And a lot of it is to do with tradition. A lot of it is to do with looking back into generations and conflict that was around succession and inheritance. So I always like to think that the farmers are like passive communicators. So in some respect, there's lots of assumptions. There's always assumptions around succession and inheritance, but sometimes it's not really communicated. So, farmers might assume they're giving the farm to someone and assume that they might know, and successors might assume that they're getting the farm, but it's actually not communicated. So, I suppose there's a lot of reasons why it's complex and sensitive. But again, I think a lot of it boils down to tradition and maybe fear of conflict on farms.
You mentioned there the assumption, and sometimes these things are nearly taken as a given, but that conversation never happens. Does that cause issues? And I suppose, how do you best address that?
Yeah, it causes huge issues. And maybe even just to give my own example, I'm farming at home in a partnership with my dad, and I spent a bit of time in Teagasc when I was doing my work in succession inheritance and going around to discussion groups. And I always remember, I was emphasizing the importance of communication, and farmers often said to me, well, have you had the conversation at home? So I went home and I said to Dad, I said, geez, we have to have these conversations, or we have to have some conversation around succession, because I'm going to all these discussion groups and I have no credibility because they're asking me, have I had the conversation? And Dad's response was, but you're getting the farm. And I said, well, I assumed it, but we never actually chatted about it until today. So I suppose in that case, it worked out well, as in my assumption and his assumption was right. But the problem arises on many farms where the assumptions aren't correct. And the longer something waits without a conversation, the bigger the assumption builds. And then if something happens, the bigger the conflict can be at the end. So,
and is it, Tomás, something as easy as that? Because I think there'll be plenty of people listening to this that maybe had to broach the conversation, and sure, you're getting it, or sure, and it is nearly it's something as easy as that, just to nearly formalize it a little bit. And obviously, we'll talk about maybe what might fall out of that, but
I think it is. There's going to be a lot of complexity around it anyway, and as you say, sometimes there can be fallout, and I think maybe that's the big fear. But the subject does need to be started, does need to be brought up, and sometimes it's probably good to start to bring it up casually around the kitchen table. That it's not so much of a big formal conversation, but I think it can be as simple as starting that conversation and starting to say, well, have you an interest in the farm, or do you know I'm considering maybe giving you the farm, or that there's options here for you on the farm. But it is starting to broach the subject, and maybe it's breaking down the subject into smaller parts. That it doesn't have to be this big monumental conversation that's that someone fears. But I think one of the most important points even is starting the conversation early, and starting to put these thoughts into people's minds, the successors' minds, and even the siblings' minds, that there is a farm here, something does have to happen to it, who's interested in it, is it an option for people, is there a full-time income for full-time or part-time, on this farm, but really just to start that conversation happening.
And I suppose a few questions around that conversation then. Who needs to be involved with that conversation? I suppose that early piece that we spoke about is usually between a couple of people, but when you're actually sitting down and maybe having this conversation as a family, who needs to be involved in that conversation?
Yeah, so I'd say if we take the fact that there's multiple conversations, and some people listening to this podcast, it might be their kids might be older or younger, but I always think a conversation needs to start when kids are in secondary school. And that conversation is very light. It can be just around the fact that there is a farm here, and it's with all kids, it's with all sort of family members, that there's a farm here, that there's, the farm is a risk in making an income, that there's potential here. And it's sort of sussing the kids out in some respect to say, does anyone have an interest in this? What's the level of interest? And showing them the options. Because even at that stage, sometimes that's when assumptions can start. And particularly maybe with like successing kids, maybe a son or a daughter who's not taken over the farm, that's when the assumption builds up that there's this big asset worth €1 million, and as that builds up, and then their sibling gets it, and there's a bit of conflict there. So it's having that conversation earlier on to say this is an option, this is a farm, it is profitable or it isn't. There are options there if anyone is interested, starting that off early. Then I suppose when kids move on into college stage, there's a clear idea maybe of who's going in the route of agriculture or not, or who might be the successor. So again, it's at that stage having a conversation around options for the future of the farm, part-time, full-time options if someone's to come home and farm, if people want sites from the farm and that sort of stuff, then maybe, and again, that's a conversation with all the kids, I suppose, early career, when people are starting to finish college, maybe move into careers, again, conversations had there probably because there's a different life stage. Kids now have maybe partners and are starting families, then they might be looking at a site on the farm, or they might be looking now at maybe different income requirements. So I suppose there's lots of different conversations happen at different stage who should be involved. As I said, kids at the younger stage, but then as they get older, that's really up to the individuals themselves, whether they think partners should be involved. And that's a question I get a lot. Should we involve our husband or wife or boyfriend or girlfriend in this conversation? And I think if the farm is directly affecting them, for example, if a successor is taking on a farm that's in debt, well, then obviously their partner should be involved in that conversation. Or if there's discussions around the site where someone's going to live, then partners should probably be involved in that conversation. But if that's not the case, then maybe it's just the kids themselves. So it's really up to the individual, but it's an important thing to think about before they have a conversation about who should be involved in it.
Yeah, that's an interesting piece because I had a question kind of lined up for you, which you've answered in terms of is there particular life stages, but you've outlined that very clearly, and it probably it preempts maybe some of these tougher conversations, Tomás, and the fact that there is an understanding there from a kind of a early stage or from these different stage conversations as to what's happening, and the picture's probably a lot clearer then within the household as to what's happening.
Yeah, because again, getting back to your first question around the communication, like generally everyone loves their kids equally and in some respect wants to look after them all and don't cause conflict. So, if the assumptions has built up and a farmer maybe has a very clearly identified successor, but it's not a big farm, let's say, and they're afraid about giving it to one son or daughter because they'll fall out with the other son or daughter, they might fall out with them. That can be a huge barrier to having the conversation. But I always say it's important to address the issue. If there is conflict, let it fall out and try and resolve it, as opposed to someone passing on in the future and leaving huge conflict behind them for generations and generations, which is very common when it comes to succession. And I'm sure most of the listeners to this podcast will be able to identify examples that they're aware of where there's been conflict as a result of a succession issue. So again, it just emphasizes the importance of having that conversation, having it early with all of the kids, and starting to break down those barriers and those assumptions.
Is there a point then within those conversations, Tomás, where there needs to be a formal plan put in place, or is it good enough to have that conversation and everybody knows where to stand?
No, it's always good to put a formal plan in place, and maybe I suppose closer to the time when maybe when the kids are moving into that career stage, I think it's then good to put a plan in place. So it can be chatted about verbally or informally up to that, but to actually push a plan in place. And it can be as simple as like the approach that I use with a lot of farm families is even getting everyone to think about if I was working with a farm family, you'd divide everyone up and you'd say, give them a simple exercise about their needs, their expectations, and their wants from the farm. So all family members involved in that, and it's a really nice way of starting the conversation and putting a plan in place, because some people will have needs around maybe education if they're still in education. Some people might have needs around a site for a house, or maybe want a small bit of land. Some people, the parents generally have their own needs and expectations around care and living in the farm home if it's based on the farm and stuff like that. So I think even a simple plan like that can be really useful for the whole family. Then there's obviously a separate farm plan for the farmer and the successor as well in terms of how the farm might be transferred over if they're going to move into a partnership and try that out for a while first. But yeah, so plans are always good. Some farmers maybe not so good at making those plans. Again, I think it's around not really sure how to make them. So the simple exercise like the needs, the expectations, and the wants can be a really nice way to start a conversation and start putting maybe a bit of a plan in place for the whole family.
Is there is there confusion around the idea of succession and inheritance? And often maybe that there's a fear of having that conversation because it's the inheritance piece that people are thinking
Mm,
about or transferring the asset, whereas maybe just explain the difference of those two, the difference
yeah,
between succession and inheritance, because I think that possibly is a barrier as well at farm level.
yeah, absolutely. I suppose again, just to give another little story. I remember my time in Teagasc when I was doing my research on succession, that farmers would obviously, because I was doing the research, I was curious, and farmers might come into the office and I'd say, what's the story around succession? And the response I got in a lot of cases was, I'm not dying yet,
Mm.
was what farmers thought. So again, the perception that succession is them stopping farming or leaving farming or handing over the farm was the strong perception there. Succession is defined as the gradual transfer of the management to the farm from one generation to the next, whereas inheritance is the legal transfer of the ownership from one generation to the next. So it's really nice, I think, to think of them that way, because what that means is like inheritance is something and the legal transfer of ownership is something that's done by a solicitor and accountant, and that's done in a period of months or maybe a year, whereas the succession process is everything from the identification of a successor to setting up a succession plan, having the discussion with the family, that maybe setting up a partnership, collaborative farming arrangements. So, like succession is a really positive thing. It's having two people working together. It's shared management. It's good communication. It's a farm that's progressing and doing well. So it's all of those positive things. So I think that's what farmers should consider it in that context. That it's always good to have a succession conversation because that's more so around how we're going to keep this farm going and building. And maybe to get a bit academic on you, there's there's a term there called the successor effect, which was well known and well researched at this stage. But they've done lots of research around this, and it's proven where once a successor is identified on a farm, they can see that efficiency, productivity, profitability on that farm increases. Whereas if successors are not identified, they all go in the opposite direction. They drop. So it's even so important from a farm productivity and efficiency perspective to have a successor identified. And it makes sense because if you have someone identified to take over the farm, you're more likely to, well, there's someone going to take over this. So we will look at investing, building a new shed. We will look at
Mhm.
infrastructure development or, new modern equipment or whatever, because you can see that it's, someone's there to move it forward.
That's an important point, Tomas, in the fact that probably having that succession plan and getting maybe that younger person involved, and you mentioned there in terms of improving the efficiencies and the profitability, it maybe allows some of those expectations then to be met as well. Whereas we often maybe look at a particular farm example and at a point in time or at a point in efficiency, maybe those expectations can't be met, and it takes a bit of work over time to allow those expectations to be met. Is that often maybe forgotten about a little bit in this process?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. Yeah, I think it's always forgotten about, but it's such an important thing because like you're looking, yeah, at the end of the day, you're looking at the future of the farm and you're looking at, most farmers want to see the farm doing well and progressing, and this is the prime opportunity for that to happen.
It, I'm looking at some of your research yesterday evening. I see a term there you used, the succession ladder, as an
Mm.
ideal way of kind of that transfer and management from the farmer to the successor, and
Yeah,
that's a tough thing to do, handing over the reins as such,
mm,
and albeit on a partial basis. But can maybe explain that concept and how to best maybe go about doing that in the day-to-day setting.
yeah. Well, I suppose maybe even the context of that is it's trying to look at how you transfer the farm or transfer the management of the farm at least across to the next generation. Because I think like you have in some cases, your enthusiastic young farmer who's coming in and wants to invest and throw money at the farm and build, come in on day one and put in the new parlor and increase cow numbers and get loans and build the farm forward. And it's trying to, I suppose, it's trying to marry the two objectives of the older farmer and the younger farmer. So it's a nice way of showing that actually, there can be a process in place where the younger farmer gets some level of responsibility. And so they have an opportunity to exert some management on the farm, and the older farmer has an opportunity to test them out in some respects. Because I know, like, young farmers always can be very enthusiastic, and older farmers can be sometimes a bit wary around the young farmer coming in and, not realizing the financial situation of the farm. So, it's
Mm.
something simple as starting to hand over, give charge to day-to-day activities on the farm and and then maybe move into a bit more strategic management duties in a few years later, which could be around, buying stock or, the feed fertilizer decisions, and then moving forward maybe to more of the financial decisions on the farm before eventually taking over all of the management decisions on the farm. So it depends, on farm by farm basis, but I suppose it's so important for farmers to actually start to give over some level of responsibility to the younger farmers that they can feel like they have some sort of say on the farm. And that's a really good way of getting young farmers interested because maybe on a side, like definitely lately I'm seeing a lot of cases where farmers are saying, with the struggles, some of the struggles in agriculture at the minute, farmers are not so sure about um young farmers' engagement in agriculture and whether it's the best career. But I think it's such a rewarding career and such an excellent career, and it is a matter of allowing young farmers a bit of an opportunity to flex their arms in the business and show what
Mm.
they can do. And it's a win-win for both because the older farmer then can see and the young farmer can learn and that they actually have some good ideas and you're allowing them to get that bit of say in the farm while not having to give them over full ownership. So again, getting back to your question around the planning, sometimes or putting a plan in place, sometimes this can be the plan that you say, okay, look, for the first 2 years, this is what the younger farmer is in charge of. This is your job. I'm going to give over the reins fully to you. You're in charge of the breeding on this farm, or you're in charge of soil fertility. I won't get involved. I'll help you with it. And then after, if that goes well, after another 2 or 3 years, you know, you can be in charge of more strategic planning or investment, so if we need to invest something on the farm or build a new parlor or, buy some new equipment and then see how that goes after a few years. And then finally, if all's gone well after 4 or 5 years or 6 years, you can always, I think the peak point of it is getting control of the checkbook maybe.
Mm. And it is really about that kind of building confidence. It gives the young person confidence coming in, but also in terms of, as you say, it gives the farmer that confidence that they're serious about this. They do deliver in the task that's given to them.
Yeah.
So it's about building confidence in one another.
Because something to be conscious of as well that sort of feeds into that is this whole thing around objectives. So like generally farmers might have, the older farmer might be a bit more traditional in their thinking. They might be more conservative in their investment. Younger farmers coming in might be more environmentally focused or might be more innovative and tech focused. And sometimes that's where conflict can happen in that sort of intergenerational transfer where, the older farmer is not interested in the more technology or modern stuff and the young farmer is. And it's trying to marry those two objectives to actually allow space for both. And that's where that sort of succession ladder or that plan can really help, because it can say, okay, like for the first few years, maybe you can invest one piece of, we'll try one new innovative thing. We'll get the low emission slurry spreader. We'll get the ID readers or whatever it is on the farm, and we'll test how that goes. So the older farmer is getting a bit more openness to that, and then the younger farmer feels like they're introducing something new into the farm.
Yeah, absolutely. Having that process, just one question, does that actually aid when the time does come regarding farm transfer, I suppose, that whole succession process, and I suppose a clear understanding of where that's at? Does that actually aid that process when the time does come for full farm transfer?
Absolutely, because what you've done at that stage is I suppose the young farmers tried and tested in some respects. You've had the opportunity to break down some of the barriers around the objectives and the complexity, and everyone feels a bit more confident in the process, as well as that. Generally, the siblings have seen that their brother or sister is, the person that's taken over the farm. They've been involved in levels of management that, all of those sort of discussions have been had, or at least can see them in action. So, at the end of the day, the confidence is there to transfer over the farm. But I suppose even on that, like in terms of the transfer, the collaborative farming arrangements that we have there, particularly in partnerships, are absolutely excellent. They're really good opportunities. They give, good decision making for the younger farmers and the older farmers on the farm. So while farm transfer is important, particularly maybe for financial security, it shouldn't be the first thing we think about. But again, part of that plan, so that, as you say, you're on that succession ladder, you've that process in place, and then that's the end result. But by the time you get to that, it's already sort of embedded in the farm. Everyone knows where they stand.
I'm conscious too that maybe some listeners we have of the podcast, Tomas, maybe don't have an identified successor.
Yeah.
What are you saying to those particular farmers at the moment?
Yeah, and that's a really important point, because for many reasons, people mightn't have their identified successor. It might be that they've no one that's interested in the farm, or it might be that they've no kids, or um, they've just known that they can pick out for the farm. I suppose the important part about that is that there are loads of options out there. So I think one really good option to consider is the land mobility service, which matches up older farmers and younger farmers who are interested in getting into collaborative farming arrangements. So, like our ag colleges, there's huge amounts of young farmers in the ag colleges and studying agriculture at the minute who are really interested in farming. And it doesn't necessarily need to be that a young farmer has to eventually take ownership of the farm. A lot of young farmers, again, want that management responsibility on farm. They want to be able to put their stamp on it. So I think, particularly with the collaborative farming arrangements, there's loads of opportunities for those that don't have an identified successor and maybe would like someone to be involved in the farm with them and managing, running the farm with them, and really conscious that farmers have such a wealth of knowledge around their own farms that's been built up over generations and generations, and to have that opportunity to transfer that to a younger farmer as well while working with them is a huge benefit for any young farmer. So I think that's one really good option to consider. Another case that I come across a lot, which I always find interesting, is maybe where someone has kids or nieces or nephews, but they've no identified successor, or they're not interested in taking over the farm. But I suppose some of the research we found is generally that someone that's grown up in a farm still has attachment to the farm. So you'll often find that a lot of these sons or daughters or nieces or nephews don't want the farm sold, or they don't want it to go anywhere. So again, like the collaborative farming arrangements or the likes of land mobility service is really interesting, where you can potentially get more than a farm manager in, because if they're a partner, if they're involved in a partnership, they have a vested interest in seeing the farm doing well. So you can get someone in a non-family farm partnership, and then eventually at some stage, maybe the son or daughter, niece or nephew can take over the part of that partnership and maybe be more so the silent partner if they want. But I suppose the overall aim is that the farm is progressing and the farm is doing well. So I suppose there is loads of options there for those who don't have identified successors.
Maybe the last point Are there a few main issues that you come across when having these conversations and when dealing with farm families? And I suppose your few points on how you best overcome them. You probably discussed them in terms of a lot, in terms of having that conversation. But is there anything that kind of crops up on a regular basis, Tomás, that you can give it a little bit of advice to?
Um, yeah, I suppose like some of the big key points that would come up is, struggling to start the conversation. That's probably always the biggest one. And when you get brought into, and I suppose on that point, actually, some farm families for various reasons just will never be able to start a conversation around succession. It's not something that they feel comfortable with. But there's lots of people out there to help and support that. So lots of mediators. I'm thinking particularly of Succession Ireland, and Claire O'Keefe is excellent in terms of helping people work through some of those issues and those conversations. So I suppose step number one is starting a conversation, and that is, one of the big issues people have. In a lot of cases, there's uncertainty maybe around successors, uncertainty around the capability of successors. Always the case comes up about marital breakdown, and what happens if a son or a daughter is married and there's a marital breakdown and taking half of the farm. I suppose they're a lot of maybe the common things that come up. So again, so the first thing is the conversation, starting the conversation and giving like simple tools, simple exercises such as that needs, wants, expectations. Can be a really nice way of getting over that and getting people getting people thinking about it. In a lot of cases around the farm transfer and the marital breakdown, sometimes it's about just looking into a partnership first. And I think there's in some cases, some myths around partnerships that people think you have to transfer ownership. Like partnership is very much around sharing management duties on farm. So I think it's a really nice way to test things out, give people responsibility and secure income without necessarily having to transfer any ownership at the very beginning, at least. And sometimes that can be a nice way of testing things out for a while anyway, before the marital issue might come in, or addressing that fear at least.
Is it important for farmers to maybe have a conversation with their maybe professional people outside of the family as well, their advisor, maybe their accountant, get a little bit of advice in terms of what they're thinking before they maybe even broach the subject, Tomás?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the advisor is probably the best placed person to give advice on this. I always remember during my study, when I was talking to accountants and solicitors, some accountants and solicitors that are phenomenal with this and excellent in terms of giving advice. But they did say to me, solicitors will give you the best legal advice, accountants will give you the best tax advice, but sometimes they might not be able to give you the best advice for you and your family. So that's where your advisor is best placed. They know your farm, they know in a lot of cases you and your family. So sometimes it's talking with your advisor first, and talking with your family and coming up with a plan, and then bringing that plan to either your solicitor or your accountant, and they'll tell you the most efficient way to, I suppose, to roll out that plan. But actually your advisor, or someone like, a mediator or someone that's going to help you with that succession conversation is best placed. That should be your first port of call when it comes to issues around succession inheritance in that conversation, so you can get the best plan for you and your family.
Thanks very much, Tomás. I think, we've got some excellent insight into, I suppose, most importantly, how to have that conversation and having that conversation at different life stages, and how to maybe put a plan in place that best suits the needs of everybody within the farm family. So folks, that's it for this week's episode of the Dairy Edge podcast. My thanks to Dr. Tomás Russell for joining me on this week's show. If you have any questions about this week's episode, or have any suggested topics you would like discussed, you can send them to us at the following email address: dairyedge.podcast@teagasc.ie. Don't forget to rate, review and subscribe to the podcast. You can listen on Apple, Spotify or wherever you get your podcasts. And for more information, go to the Teagasc website at teagasc.ie. I'm James Dunne, and join us next time for your Dairy Edge.